Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen of the media, and of course the listening and viewing public at home. Welcome to yet another post-cabinet media conference for today. And today, again, we'll have Minister Stuart Young giving us a synopsis of what the cabinet would like us to know. Minister.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, members of the media, citizens of Trinidad and Tobago. It's my pleasure to let you know one of the major decisions taken by Cabinet this morning, which has to do with the continued fight against crime. As you would be aware, there are currently provisions with respect to the law in relation to bail that provide for with respect to certain crimes to deal with kidnapping for ransom, anti-gang legislation, as well as the illegal possession and use of firearms. There is a provisions currently in place that provide that persons who are charged with offences, with respect to those offences, are not eligible for bail. Now, what is happening is that was actually last dealt with by the last administration, and it is actually coming up for expiry in August of this year. So we've taken to Cabinet today and it's been approved, and I shall be speaking with the opposition to solicit their support because the legislation that's being proposed requires a special majority. The important points are as follows. The legislation requires a special majority, but it is currently in place and was supported by the PNM when it was in opposition, because we saw this as being very necessary, a very necessary tool in the fight against crime. It's only in relation to crimes with respect to illegal possession of firearms and use of firearms, anti-gang legislation, as well as kidnapping offences. And immediately we think that the citizens of Trinidad and Tobago would appreciate the serious nature of those crimes. And what this law does is persons who are charged with respect to those offences are not eligible for bail. The prosecution then has 120 days within which to bring the evidence to court and commence the case, failing which the persons can then be eligible to apply to the magistrate or the High Court judge for bail. So what we're letting the population know is that these provisions that are currently in place in law and the law enforcement agencies, as well as the government, believe that they are a tool in the fight against crime, because of course you have a lot of repeat offences taking place, especially with respect to the illegal possession and use of firearms and anti-gang legislation. What we think is that this should continue. So we're bringing legislation into Parliament in a short time frame, and I'm going to be speaking to the opposition between today and tomorrow to solicit their support to extend these provisions for 2 years. So what we're doing is seeking to extend the provisions until August 2018 to allow the law enforcement agencies as well as the prosecutorial arms to have the ability of no eligibility for bail for these offences continuing for the next 2-year period. So this is something that you will be seeing coming to Parliament within the next couple of weeks for debate, and we really hope that the opposition will be a responsible opposition, especially as when they were the government, we supported it when we were in opposition, and that they would continue to be responsible, because this is not a tool that is of this administration. It is a tool that we believe and law enforcement believes is significant in the fight against crime, which affects all citizens of Trinidad and Tobago. So this is it's going to be the Miscellaneous Provisions Anti-Gang and Bail Bill 2016, and you will be seeing it put laid in Parliament and debated within the next couple of weeks before Parliament goes on recess. Thank you. That is the major decision that was taken this morning that I wanted to alert you all to. I'd now give you the opportunity, should you have any questions, I'll take your questions.
Minister, in relation to the bill that we're talking about here, is it a 3/5 majority we're talking about?
It is. It's a special majority.
Okay. And is there a specific date in which you're hoping that this matter will come to the House and Senate?
We're going to bring it in the next couple of weeks because the current state of play, the legislation that's in place, expires on the 14th of August of this year. And this legislation, what is proposed is that it will continue for 2 years from the 14th of August. So we're making sure there's no break, there's no lacuna in the timing that would affect persons who are affected by this legislation.
Are we looking at any other type of measures coming alongside this one which will help deal with the whole issue of taking care of the illegal firearm issue?
The law enforcement agencies have been putting in place a number of measures and have been working very feverishly with respect to the stemming, the finding, and cutting off of this illegal arms that we're seeing prevalent in society. But they are working on it.
Could you also perhaps give us an idea as to where things stand in terms of proclamation of the SSA bill?
The Substantive Attorney General is not here right now, but I expect that the proclamation of the SSA Act, because it's now an act, will be taking place very shortly.
Now, I'm almost certain, given the record, that the opposition would probably want to do some horse trading. In other words, in exchange for their support, they would probably make demands of the government. Is the government prepared to do any kind of bargaining to get support for this bill, or is it going to watch the bill fall on the basis of support this or nothing?
Yeah, I am not prepared to speculate at this stage. We as a government will cross that bridge if and when we come to it. But I would hope, and I'm calling upon the opposition at this stage to be a responsible one. Their duty is not to the government. Their duty is to the citizenry of Trinidad and Tobago. And this is a measure that affects the lives of every citizen of Trinidad and Tobago. So this is not something that is unique to this government and this current administration. The responsibility for the passage of this legislation lies at the feet of both the government and the opposition. And if the opposition wants to go to the public in a time where we're all trying to band together to fight the scourge of crime, and they think that they have an explanation to give the public as to why they would not be responsible in supporting the continuation of these measures, that's a decision for them to take. But certainly as we sit here, we are letting the population know that it is this government's position that the continuation of these measures are necessary and a necessary tool in the fight against crime, and we are taking responsibility by letting the population know that and bringing the legislation to Parliament in good time to ensure that there's no lapse. If the opposition want to engage in behavior, that would be for them to explain. At this stage, I'm not prepared to sit here and speculate as to what they may ask for. But we are concerned that the matter of fighting crime is not a politicized one, because it affects the lives of every citizen of Trinidad and Tobago.
On another matter, I know that you came to the Parliament with a statement on the SIS matter.
Correct. The
Now,
Betham wastewater plant.
Right. Now we see today that the court has agreed to have their assets unfrozen. What is the government's position on that?
Well, I'm glad that you raised that, because I was very, very surprised to see the report in today's newspaper and also to observe the inaccuracy of the report. I have been following up on this matter, and in fact, I was fully briefed with respect to the matter. There has been no lifting of the injunction with respect to the SIS assets. There has been no dismissal of the matter brought by NGC against SIS. In fact, my understanding is that the judge who's charged with the responsibility for this matter, and of course it's sub judice, so I don't want to say very much about it, has called for a hearing tomorrow morning. My understanding is that the SIS attorneys have taken a certain position in law, which the NGC attorneys believe is wholly incorrect and inaccurate. A judge, I guess, will have to decide that. But what I can stand here and say today is the matter has not been dismissed. The matter has not been thrown out. It still is a very current, very live matter. And in particular, there has been no lifting of the injunction over SIS's assets. So the public should appreciate that, and everyone who may be called upon to do anything in relation to SIS's assets, be very careful, because despite what was reported in today's newspapers, the injunction continues to be in place. I do also understand that the attorneys may be looking at contempt proceedings, because I do understand that Rainforest, which appears to be a shell company, had certain mortgages over the assets of SIS to a certain tune. Those may have been released and discharged, which may very well be in breach of the court's order.
Could you explain that a little bit?
What had happened in this matter is it had been discovered that a company called Rainforest had taken mortgages without the passage of any money, no money passed, so mortgages for hundreds of millions of dollars over SIS's assets without giving SIS the return value for that. My understanding is when this was brought to the attention of the court, the explanation was it was a precautionary measure, but I don't want to say much more than that because the matter is a live issue before the court. Those mortgages have now apparently been released. So Rainforest has released their mortgages over the SIS assets. That action of releasing may very well be one that is in contempt of the current court order, because the court order is that you should not be dealing with those particular assets. That will be determined by the judge. If the lawyers on both sides will argue it, but that did come as a bit of a surprise, and it is being very closely monitored. But as it stands right now, I'd like to re-emphasize the injunction continues to be in place over SIS's assets, and the matter brought by NGC in the High Court of Trinidad and Tobago against SIS continues to be a live one and has not been dismissed.
Mr. Minister, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
There are several matters underpinning what you addressed us about earlier, the question of crime. And for all the good intentions and the effort by the Minister of National Security and, of course, the government of Trinidad and Tobago, there still is concern by the general population about this new trend in grenade discoveries. Has this been discussed in the context of what can be done, to get rid of this scourge? Also, in the context of the police commissioner, we know that he's acting. Where is his position as we speak now in the context of what will happen? Because we gather that he was on a 6-month extension.
Okay. If I may answer the first one, what we had happening earlier this week, and as the population now knows, is we had a false alarm that we had a certain device being found that had the appearance of a grenade, but of course, upon close and proper examination, it was found to be a cigarette lighter, which in of itself was illegal because, of course, it resembles a grenade. The law enforcement agencies are working on the fight against crime. Of course, one of the elements of the fight against crime are any illegal firearms, any illegal explosive devices, etc. And this again brings to the forefront the importance of intelligence gathering, because one of the ways that you successfully fight crime is by having the intelligence and taking action in a proactive manner as opposed to a reactive manner. So they are working on that. You've also heard, and yesterday you heard from the Minister of National Security, and yesterday he went down to Cedrus to see what was going on down there. The maritime patrols have been increased. It is something at National Security level, Council level, we are very aware of, and we've been pushing the authorities to increase the number of patrols. The Minister of National Security has reported that he's had very good discussions with his Venezuelan counterparts. One of the issues they're discussing is closing off these porous borders. So they are working assiduously in shutting down, or hopefully reducing the porousness of the borders. That's one element of dealing with it. With respect to the acting commissioner of police, as the population is aware, one of the first matters dealt with by this government was the simplification of the process to appoint a permanent commissioner of police. We did it. We laid the order was debated. It is the law. We've triggered it. The only, and I emphasize, the only participation the executive has in that process is by asking that it commence. That was done months ago. The Police Service Commission are the ones charged with the responsibility of taking it through the process to have the appointment of a permanent commissioner of police. So the question as to where that process has reached, I think would be better directed to the Police Service Commission.
Has the government been updated on how far advanced the Police Service Commission is in that process?
The last update that we got was after we had requested it to be commenced. It has been commenced, and we have expected that by this time the identification of a firm through a public procurement process would have been done.
On the issue of the bail amendment bill, if I'm not mistaken, when it was brought to the Parliament under the former administration, there were concerns raised by the then opposition and also the independent bench about that 120-day period and the potential for errant lawmen to infringe upon the human rights of some of these people who may be held under that bill. And I'm wondering if going forward, it will be wholesale, or will there be amendments to deal with some of those concerns?
At this stage, as a government, we've taken a decision, a conscious decision, to merely go to Parliament asking that the current existing provisions, including the 120 days, be extended for 2 years. So we're trying to avoid any such potential arguments, etc. We've seen how the law has been working. It is now, there's been a passage of time, and we think it wise and prudent at this stage to merely engage in a 2-year extension of the law. At that time, we can have conversations, we can have debates, let law enforcement tell us what it is they would like to suggest, etc. But certainly the proportionality arguments that existed at that time, that 120 days is sufficient, is constitutional, it does not infringe on human rights, would be equally applicable at this time.
On a separate issue, has the government been apprised of that report that the Minister of Roads and Transport had requested into the speed limit adjustment from 80 to 100 kilometers an hour? Because he said that report would have been presented in a week. It's been a month now, and we've heard nothing about any adjustments to the speed limit on the highways.
I think that question would be best directed to the Minister of Works and Transport. I have not had an update on it.
Drew Brown, TV6 News Minister, as you mentioned, the police and so on. I'm just wondering, there's now a debate in the public domain about the payment, the back pay, to those in the protective services, public service. We're told about money is being used from the Heritage and Stabilization Fund towards this effect. Does the law allow for that to be done with that particular fund?
I think you're asking two particular questions there. Firstly, with respect to the back pay, I believe the Minister of Finance has spoken to this. There was a recent press release from the Ministry of Finance. That is the position. The Minister of Finance has said that the information has been requested with respect to the various services that have to provide it in order to ensure that the payments are made. With respect to the Heritage and Stabilization Fund, it was first raised in the budget and then by the Honourable Prime Minister in his address to the nation in December. And then at the mid-year review, the government had raised through the Minister of Finance and then, of course, the Honourable Prime Minister in December, that one of the elements that could be utilized by this administration with respect to bridging any gaps that needed to be bridged was the Heritage and Stabilization Fund, and more particularly the stabilization side of the fund. What I'm happy to tell the public of Trinidad and Tobago is the Minister of Finance will continue to address this with a comprehensive statement in Parliament tomorrow.
Well, then I'm hoping that maybe there's some clarification on this issue of the stabilization component as opposed to the heritage component, because from what I understand, the Act, it may mention it has two different purposes, but there isn't a situation where there are two distinct portions of the fund under the law, as far as I know, and I stand to be corrected.
Let's wait for the statement from the Minister of Finance tomorrow in Parliament. It is going to address a number of areas.
And also, as you have mentioned, the issue of the acting police commissioner raised by my colleague. Is the government looking at the actual law as it stands now for the appointment of the police commissioner? Is that something this administration is doing?
What I had said, Jules, is we had actually looked at it, and that was one of the first pieces of legislation we've brought to Parliament. It is now the current law. What we've done is, in our view, completely simplified the process whilst protecting the integrity of the process for the appointment of a commissioner of police. And the only influence or the only connection that the executive has with it is to ask that the process be commenced. So we believe that what we saw before was a very complicated, complex process and procedure, and we've sought to simplify that and still leave the powers for the appointment of a commissioner, a permanent commissioner of police, with, obviously, the Police Service Commission. So we've already done that.
And with the issue of the fight against crime, I'm wondering, what about the issue of DNA evidence, the collection? Because the detection rate for homicides continues to be very low. And from what I've gathered in the past, the DNA evidence was supposed to help raise that detection rate. But we're still wondering what is going on with that particular aspect of it.
As you know, the legislation with respect to it was passed some time ago. It has recently arisen in the public domain that perhaps there's not a proper collection bank and a database being built. This is something that is now attracting the attention of the Ministry of National Security, under whose portfolio that falls.
So is it that the government is looking for a new contract? Is this a situation with the existing system? A firm is being contracted abroad to do it, or could you give us a sense of
I don't have the particulars, but my understanding and my belief would be that it is now something that they have to look into the implementation of the law with respect to it.
I just wanted to follow up on a question my colleague asked earlier about these hoaxes. I mean, as a minister and as a cabinet, and we've seen in the last couple of weeks, when there be hoax calls, they've been increasing exponentially. And as a cabinet, are we concerned about it? And what do you say to those people who are involved in calling? We saw one in a mall, 2 malls at least, a school yesterday, and there is a sense of an unsettling feeling in the population with these things happening. I'm just wondering, as a cabinet, what is your response, and what do you tell people?
Absolutely, we're concerned. This is very irresponsible, mischievous, wrong behavior on behalf of those who would participate in those attempts. You would have seen, and I'd like to correct you, it was not 2 threats being called into 2 separate malls. I personally had taken the opportunity to try and alleviate all concerns and to get rid of the rumors and to cut them off and to stop any panic that was beginning to set in, and I think that was successfully done. We had a situation where a threat was called into a mall. The owners of that mall owned another mall and took a decision, because there were only a few establishments opened on that day, to close down Long Circular Mall. Prince City Mall was closed off and was properly swept. We've had recently this week another apparent hoax call being called in at the University of the West Indies. Again, immediately protocols went into place. There was an evacuation process that was carried out by the University of the West Indies and their security. When the law enforcement agencies, through the form of the police service, were called in, they followed their protocol, a sweep was done, and of course, thankfully, it was found that it was a hoax call. Two points in relation to that. The Ministry of the Attorney General and Legal Affairs has put out now to make it very, very clear that such calls by persons are in breach of the Anti-Terrorism Act. If sufficient evidence is found with respect to persons making those calls, they will be prosecuted with the full blunt of the law. There's no doubt about that. It is extremely irresponsible behavior upon persons setting about doing that. Then the second part is that the law enforcement agencies remain alert. The population, including ourselves in this room and those listening, as citizens of Trinidad and Tobago, remain alert, as the Minister of National Security has said, and as I myself have said. We all have a responsibility to remain alert. If there are any things untoward, bring it to the attention immediately of the law enforcement authorities. But we as citizens have to have an outcry now, and the outcry isn't directed at the government, because we're not the ones encouraging or supporting this irresponsible behavior. To tell those who are doing it that they will feel the full brunt of the law when they are apprehended. And also it brings to the fore once again the need for proper intelligence gathering and perhaps interception of communications with respect to these calls as they come in, so that we will be able to successfully gather the evidence to have a successful prosecution at the end of the day. But certainly the government's position, the Cabinet of Trinidad and Tobago's position, this is not something that is encouraged. It is very, very irresponsible, and it should immediately cease and desist.
Minister, just continuing on from another question that you would have answered earlier with respect to highways, so going a little further down the road, if you will.
No pun intended.
No pun intended. Has any decision been taken regarding the existing contractual arrangement for OAS and the Solomon Hochway Highway extension? Now, I recall that when the Prime Minister left on his recent trip to the US, UK, Ghana, and so on, he did express a particular concern about that particular arrangement. So, and that has been something that the government has talked about very frequently.
Correct.
In and out of office. So, has any decision been taken with respect to the future of that project, OAS's continued involvement in it, and anything you can tell us on that?
Yes, I can. The government is on record as saying that that highway and that project will be completed. A review of it is currently underway because what we had found, and in particular I had done a ministerial statement to the Parliament about some of the disturbing matters we'd found taking place with respect to that highway, and in particular contract addendum number 2. They had changed and narrowed the end of the highway, making it a single, so therefore a double lane. There was the conversion of a number of interchanges to roundabouts, etc. So those obviously are being reviewed from a policy position. With respect in particular to OAS, the NIDCO, the body charged with the responsibility, has been working along with its legal team with respect to how to deal with that and how they intend to deal with the OAS. I don't want to say much more than that at this stage. But in parallel to that, they have also been looking and to advise us shortly as to how they advise is the best way to move towards an expedient completion of the highway.
Mr. Minister, there's a question that I posed to the Prime Minister previously with respect to the prevalence of guns in our country. It had to do with the suggestion of gun court, gun amnesty, and of course the limited state of emergency in those areas where the gun violence was prevalent. The Prime Minister did treat with the question of the limited state of emergency to suggest that, of course, it impacts on the economy, and you couldn't have that at this time. Has there been any, anybody concerned about the establishment of a gun court and the effect that that can have on, let's say, use or anti-use of guns? That's one. Secondly, how close is the realization of the Trinidad and Tobago manufacturing sector accessing that 50 million revolving fund that was announced by President Maduro on his visit to Trinidad and Tobago recently?
Let me start with the gun court. The gun court is something that the Office of the Attorney General and Legal Affairs has been looking at. A gun court does require a number of constitutional provision. It's affected by the Constitution. As you would be aware, they had tried it in Jamaica before. There are a number of immediate matters that have been put into place, and the law enforcement agencies and authorities are working because, of course, it is something that affects all of us and is something we as a government are very concerned about. So we have been speaking to those who are charged with the responsibility of reducing the number of firearms. We have been speaking to them about how they intend to do it and how best to achieve it. The Minister of National Security can speak to that. But with respect to the gun court, it is a conversation that we've opened up. We did have a conversation along those lines with respect to criminal justice reform, but we're looking at the legality of it and how it has to be achieved. With respect to the $50 million US dollar revolving facility that is going to be put in place by the government of Venezuela, as you would be aware, there have been furtherance of discussion since the visit of President Maduro. Our Venezuelan counterparts were here meeting last week with the Minister of Trade. They've continued the conversation. I think now we've gotten from them their shopping list, including the quantities of the products that they need. And my understanding of how the facility will work is that they will be paying the sums of money directly to the manufacturers. And we as a government would just be here to facilitate it. But the Minister of Trade is going to be making a further statement with respect to this. But we hope by next week to finalize the numbers of items, etc., and now begin the process of getting the first set of shipments prepared to be shipped to Venezuela.
Minister, we're not in a issue. The Attorney General has said previously that he plans to make regulations for the Interception of Communications Act. I'm just wondering, if the regulations had not, if there were no regulations rather, then could the Act really be operating properly without the regulations?
The answer is yes. The Act can be and has been operating properly without regulations. As you would be aware, there are a number of pieces of parent legislation that require regulations that have never been put into place, but it does not hamper or make illegal the activities that are being carried out under the powers granted by the parent legislation. And that's just one piece of legislation that falls into that category.
And also, you had announced when the Hawks call had been made that led to the evacuation of Twin City Mall, that the phone had been identified and so on. What about this issue of getting the evidence in such cases for successful prosecution? I'm not too sure exactly what happened in that particular instance.
As you all would recall, I was very, very careful at the time in announcing the particular facts as to what had taken place. I said that a person was apprehended, that person was found to be in possession of the phone from which the call was made. There is a continuing investigation. I was informed by the police up to this week, and I'm hoping that they have a breakthrough with that investigation very soon to be able to apprehend the person from who made the call from that phone. But you're right, there must always in every single matter be a careful gathering of the evidence, which is one of the factors in a successful prosecution.
One final one.
One final one.
Is the government aware that there are reports that the treatment afforded by the immigration authorities to people from Venezuela and other Latin American countries is different from that given to CARICOM nationals from places like Jamaica and Guyana and so on? And that is one of the issues fueling the stress within the region. I know the Prime Minister is going to Jamaica in this regard, but are you all picking up anything like that, and what would you say? Are you sure that our immigration authorities are in fact being fair to everyone who comes in, and that there isn't anything underneath the surface that is going on?
Ria, that's a very, very unfair question. To answer that, no, I am not aware of any different treatment between any particular persons who land on our shores of Trinidad and Tobago, be it via the seashores or via the airports. That is something that we will take note of. But I am aware that with respect to the issue with Jamaica, the Prime Minister, when he came back from his trip to Cuba, did tell the country that he had spoken, had a private side room meeting with the Prime Minister of Jamaica. I've seen that the Prime Minister of Jamaica is also on record at saying that those conversations were very productive conversations, the result of which will be a visit by our Prime Minister, Dr. Keith Rowley, to the shores of Jamaica in the not too distant future. But with respect to what you've raised of being aware of any discriminatory treatment between various citizens of other countries coming into Trinidad and Tobago, we're not aware of that at this time. I'd like to thank you all very much.